I think about Jesus and Zacchaeus, and Jesus invites himself into Zacchaeus, the tax collector's home. And Zacchaeus was not an ICE officer, but he was using the force of the empire, of the state, to get money out of the population. There's a change. Zacchaeus changes at the end and engages in reparation work. So I think there's something there that communion, dining with the divine at the Eucharistic table, should be open. Also, it should be transformative. That if an ICE officer were to come to the communion table, there would be an understanding that whatever violent actions you had done before have to come to an end.
What he's offering is a counterfeit gospel. Welcome to the John Amanchukwu Show. And do me a big favor, my friends, subscribe to my YouTube channel. And never forget that there is no rhythm like the algorithm. What am I saying? Without you liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel, I can't get the truth out there. And in this dark and noisy world, yes, my friends, we need more truth and people who are willing to proclaim it. Now, in this episode, I'm going to tell you the truth about this puppet. Now, I know what a pastor looks like. I know what a pastor looks like. I know what a preacher looks like. I know what a shepherd looks like. But my friends also know what a pandering puppet looks like. If you want to see a pandering puppet, Exhibit A. Take a look at this mess.
Would I serve communion to an ICE officer?
Hold it right there.
It's a question I've been thinking about watching the...
Would I serve communion to an ICE officer? Would I serve communion to an ICE officer? Now, you can just tell by the way that he's talking and looking and acting. It's oozing out. It's oozing out. It's coming out of him. It's coming out of his pores. The deconstruction of masculinity. It's oozing out for us to hear. And now he's getting ready to make a terrible argument. Now, take a look at it.
The violence in LA and the way that the Trump administration has stoked this violence. And I feel like as a pastor, if I had an ICE officer in my congregation, I would be embarrassed as a pastor. I feel like it would be proof of a failure of pastoring and teaching and discipleship if somebody were in my congregation and they felt like it was okay for them to treat immigrants in such an awful way. That means clearly I have not done my job as someone who is supposed to teach people to imitate Christ. Now, our church practices an open communion table, meaning anyone can come and receive the elements of the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, communion, the bread and the cup, without any sort of restriction. It is an unfenced table, which is different from a lot of churches. We've had people tell us that they have been not allowed to receive communion because of their sexuality, their gender identity, because they've been divorced, because they didn't agree with a particular creedal or belief aspect. And we just don't do that. But I also know other pastors and theologians who have a problem with the open communion table because they would see something inherently violent or wrong if an immigrant and an ICE officer were at the same communion table. That there has to be some sort of fencing of the table to prevent that sort of theological travesty, basically. I think about Jesus and Zacchaeus, and Jesus invites himself into Zacchaeus, the tax collector's home. And Zacchaeus was not an ICE officer, but he was using the force of the empire, of the state, to get money out of the population. And Jesus is willing to dine with this person. But there's a change. Zacchaeus changes at the end and engages in reparation work. So I think there's something there that communion, dining with the divine at the Eucharistic table, should be open. Also, it should be transformative. That if an ICE officer were to come to the communion table, there would be an understanding that whatever violent actions you had done before have to come to an end. You cannot treat immigrants that way. It is unbiblical and unscriptural and flies in the face of the expectations of God and Jesus and how they tell us to treat the immigrant and the stranger. I don't know how to square that circle of how you have a communion table without fences, without strings attached, while also making sure that it is transformative. But I think that's got to be the case.
All right, so there you have it. Anybody have any Caesar dressing? Thousand Island dressing? Italian dressing? I don't know, a little olive oil, because that was one big word salad with with a whole lot of false teaching. This person right here, I told you, that's not a preacher. That's not a pastor. That's a pandering puppet. All right. So what's wrong with Pastor Anthony Parrot's statement? He's weaponizing the pulpit. Communion is a sacred act of remembering Christ's sacrifice. There's no such thing as an open table. The Bible gives instructions for who can approach that table. It's not a political tool to punish people who don't vote like you or work where you approve. Denying someone the Lord's table for working in law enforcement, that's spiritual abuse. The Eucharist is not a reward for the morally woke. It's for the repentant, not the politically compliant. See, 1 Corinthians 11, 27 through 29, here it goes again. Whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner must examine themselves. But if we judged ourselves truly, we would not be judged. In other words, Paul is letting us know here clearly that, man, you need to examine yourself to make sure that you're in the faith and that you are not drinking of God's blood and eating of his body unworthily. Because if you do, you're going to get weak, you're going to get sick, and ultimately, my friends, you're going to die. And so here are the key points. He's playing judge in God's place. Jesus is the only righteous judge. No pastor has the authority to demand someone quit their lawful job before they can be welcomed at the communion table. By setting ideological ultimatums, he is elevating himself above Christ's own standards for grace and mercy. Romans 14:4 says, who are you to judge someone else's servant? To their own master, servant stand or fall. James 4:12 says there is only one lawgiver and judge, the one who is able to save and destroy. But you, who are you to judge your neighbor? He's creating a false gospel, my friends. The real gospel says salvation and access to Christ is through faith and repentance, not political litmus tests. Don't forget that. What he's offering is a counterfeit gospel, one where your job determines your worthiness, not your heart before God. Galatians 1:6-9 says, if anyone is preaching to you a gospel contrary to the one you received, let him be accursed. Ephesians 2:8-9 says, for it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this not from yourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. Also, he misunderstands justice and government. ICE agents enforce the law. And Romans 13 makes it clear. Government authority is ordained by God. You get that, you parrot pandering puppet? Do you get that? It's ordained by God to keep order and restrain evil. If someone believes an ICE officer is sinning simply for enforcing immigration laws, then Jesus' own words and Paul's teachings would need to be thrown out, which is exactly what this pastor is doing. Romans 13:1-4 says, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. This guy, this pandering parrot puppet, he's guilty of division, not unity. Instead of shepherding a unified body of believers, he sows division along political lines. He's pushing ideological purity over spiritual unity. And that is not the heart of Christ. Christ welcomed tax collectors, zealots, prostitutes, and Roman officers. But Pastor Parrot, this guy, this dude, this bruh, nah. He draws the line at ICE agents. ICE agents can't come and receive repentance and salvation. See, 1 Corinthians 1:10 says, I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, that there be no divisions among you, but that you be perfectly united in mind and thought. And you know, when people come to Jesus, Jesus is not trying to quote unquote save your occupation. Whether you be an athlete, whether you be a lawyer, a doctor, or even an ICE agent, Jesus wants this. He wants your heart. He wants to save you. He wants to bring you to conviction through confrontation, then ultimately bringing you to repentance. He's not talking about your job, albeit if your job is a job that leads to wickedness and sin and debauchery, he'll convict you and get you out of that job. But being an ICE agent doesn't make you a sinner, my friends. And this is the issue with the ideology of this pandering parrot puppet. See, the bottom line is this. This is dangerous theology. Pastor Parrot's message is emotional blackmail disguised as compassion. He's not preaching the gospel. He's preaching political activism and calling it righteousness just because it came out of his lips. He thinks you should believe it. This is not about immigration. It's about control, narcissism, and the idolatry of moral superiority. Matthew 23:13 says this, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those enter who are trying to. This guy should not be followed. Cancel him because he's not a preacher. He's not a pastor. He's a pandering parrot puppet. That's what he is. Let me know what you think below in the comments section. Am I right or am I wrong? Am I weak or am I strong? God bless you, my friends, and God bless America.